forward-looking approach, carefully designed to not re-traumatize victims and survivors. Madam Speaker, thank you for this opportunity.
Madam Speaker, as we speak tonight, Israel is launching its long-threatened ground invasion of densely populated Rafah in southern Gaza. 1.4 million civilians are braced for what the United Nations warned could lead to a bloodbath. Meanwhile, Netanyahu's government has rejected the terms of a ceasefire agreement. 132 hostages remain held by Hamas, and the UN World Food Programme says northern Gaza has entered full-blown famine. Even before tonight, over 35,000 Palestinians had already been killed in Gaza over the past 7 months, including more than 15,000 children. This is all happening 2 months since the International Court of Justice called on the State of Israel to take 6 immediate steps to prevent genocide. This government must press Israel and the Netanyahu government to follow the ICJ ruling and avoid further civilian loss of life. Now, I shouldn't have to call for this. We already did it. Back in mid-March, this Parliament passed a motion that called on the Government of Canada to take 10 actions. The terms of this motion are the will of Canadians as represented by a large majority of MPs in this House, and the Parliamentary Secretary and all but 3 of his Liberal colleagues supported this motion. We've now given this government plenty of time to demonstrate it deserved the trust of Canadians in following through on the critical terms of this motion. And while one of the actions was followed, restoring funding to the UN Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, disappointingly, many actions seem to have been ignored, including ending arms exports to Israel and placing sanctions on extremist settlers. Another that seems to have been ignored was supporting the work of the International Court of Justice. And to support the ICJ, the Government of Canada must press the State of Israel to follow its ruling. One of the ICJ's 6 provisional measures issued in late January called for humanitarian aid to be allowed into Gaza. Yet, just over a month after the ruling, on February 29th, we learned of the Flower Massacre. 118 Palestinians killed, 760 injured after Israeli forces opened fire on civilians seeking food from aid trucks in Gaza City. At the time, I'd risen to press the Minister of Foreign Affairs for these ICJ measures to be followed. Yet it got worse. Just over a month later, Israel said it mistakenly struck a World Central Kitchen convoy, killing 7 aid workers, including dual Canada-U.S. citizen Jacob Flickinger. 2 weeks later, a Canadian humanitarian aid organization, the International Development and Relief Foundation, IDRF, had its water truck bombed. The water truck was paid for entirely by Canadian donors, and thousands have been without water as a result of the bombing. No humanitarian aid worker should be killed in a conflict zone. Yet, according to the UN, more than 200 have died since October 7th in Gaza. And ensuring humanitarian aid flows in Gaza is just one of 6 measures. As Greens, we continue to call for this government to press for all 6 measures to be followed by the State of Israel to prevent acts of genocide, for a ceasefire as we have since October 8th, for all hostages to be released by Hamas, for a 2-way embargo on military equipment to Israel, and for sanctions on extremist settlers. This government should be doing everything possible to protect innocent civilians, including aid workers and the hostages. Yet with the ground invasion of Rafah now underway, the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza has become all the more dire. Urgent action is needed from this government. So my question to the Parliamentary Secretary, what is his government doing in response to the invasion of Rafah, and what specifically is this government doing to call on the State of Israel to follow the ICJ ruling to prevent acts of genocide?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It goes without saying that this is an extremely difficult topic to discuss in the House of Commons. Me and the member opposite have spent some time together discussing this, and our personal views are very, very well aligned. I would actually say that we're not members opposite, particularly on this issue, but on many, many issues, we see eye to eye. And together, I know that we share an immense grief, and our hearts break for the loss of civilian life that the world has witnessed over the last over 6 months now. Those impacted are at the front of our minds. including all families and communities affected by this violence, but children in particular have been disproportionately affected by the ongoing hostilities, and that's not right. The horrific attacks by Hamas against Israeli civilians still shock us all. Hamas is a terrorist organization, and we are unequivocal in our condemnation of Hamas's terrorist attacks against Israel and the appalling loss of life and the heinous acts of violence perpetrated in those attacks. Canada condemns Hamas's unacceptable treatment of hostages and calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all remaining hostages. And Madam Speaker, what has been happening in Gaza since October 7th is absolutely catastrophic. The humanitarian situation in Gaza was already dire. The impacts of an expanded military operation in Rafah would be devastating for Palestinian civilians as well as for foreign nationals who are seeking refuge. They simply have nowhere else to go. As the minister has said, asking them to move again is unacceptable. Madam Chair, I've been to Rafah. I've visited UNRWA schools in Palestine. I've been to Gaza, and I've done humanitarian aid work in those communities. And when I visited 8 years ago, that was the toughest part of the world that I've ever seen. I'm fortunate enough to have traveled with multiple NGOs. I've seen some of the toughest, most war-affected, poorest places in the world. But Gaza 8 years ago was the toughest place I've ever seen, I've ever witnessed. And it's way, way, way worse today. Canada has been calling for an immediate, sustainable ceasefire for months now. The violence must stop. This cannot be one-sided. Hamas must release all hostages and lay down its arms. Humanitarian aid must be urgently increased and sustained. The need for humanitarian assistance in Gaza has never been greater. Rapid, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian relief must be provided to civilians. Canada was the first G7 country to act. We led the way, and we will continue to work with partners toward ensuring the sustained access of humanitarian assistance for civilians, including food, water, medical care, fuel, shelter, and access for humanitarian workers. The member from the Green Party, my colleague from Kitchener Centre, referenced the IDRF truck that was bombed, the water truck. The CEO, the Chief Executive Officer of IDRF, lives in my riding. We speak frequently, and I want to thank Mahmoud for his ongoing hard work, advocacy, and extremely challenging efforts over his entire career. To date, Canada has announced $100 million in humanitarian assistance to address the urgent needs of vulnerable civilians in this crisis. More aid must get into Gaza. We must continue to support trusted UN agencies and humanitarian actors to provide this assistance. And when it comes to UNRWA, we understand the vital role they play in delivering aid to Palestinian civilians. UNRWA needed to undertake some reform efforts, and the Secretary General of the United Nations has taken steps to enhance oversight and accountability within UNRWA, alongside the ongoing investigation and review. Madam Speaker, I see that you're motioning for me to wrap it up. I have more to say, and I will do so after my colleague's rebuttal.
The Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to start by agreeing with my friend from Milton. Yes, we condemn Hamas. Yes, Hamas must release all hostages. And yes, from his own personal experience, he knows better than most, having seen from his time in Gaza and knowing things have only gotten worse there in the time since. But what's also true is it's been 6 weeks now since this Parliament passed a motion calling on the government that he's a part of to take further action. It's been 3 months since the International Court of Justice called on the State of Israel to take 6 immediate steps to prevent acts of genocide. It's critical that this government call on Israel to follow through on that ICJ ruling. Can he speak to, particularly on this night, as we know the invasion of Rafah has begun, what can and will be done by this government to call for the ICJ ruling to be followed?
Well, Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. When it comes to South Africa's case at the International Court of Justice, the court has been clear on provisional measures. Israel must ensure the delivery of basic services and essential humanitarian assistance, and it must protect civilians. The court's decisions on provisional measures are binding. Madam Speaker, we'll continue to respond to the urgent needs of this crisis. Canada is clear that a sustainable ceasefire is absolutely critical to finding a path towards securing lasting peace for Israelis and Palestinians alike. With respect to UNRWA, Madam Speaker, I don't think I finished my thought earlier. Canada continues to hold UNRWA to the highest standards. Their credibility and their ability to continue its life-saving work absolutely depends on that, and they also depend on our support, which has not wavered. It was important that we took some time, as the other funding countries did, but no less funding went to that organization as a result of that. So we continue to work closely with the UN, with UNRWA, and with other donor countries to ensure that UNRWA meets its obligations and continue its
The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.